It's one of the most popular regions in the world, but its wines are often misunderstood. One reason for the misunderstanding might be that the best-selling styles are fairly recent inventions. Another reason surely is that they are made using a different approach in the vineyard and in the cellar. So let's dive into the wines of Valpolicella by tasting them side by side. Rosso, Ripasso, Amarone and Recioto. Andiamo! Valpolicella is located in the northeast of Italy in the Veneto region. Winemaking has a long history here, and many popular wine styles like Prosecco, Soave and Pinot Grigio are made in the neighborhood. While the wine styles Ripasso and Amarone might be considered classics in the wine world, they don't really have a long history. Amarone production only really started at the middle of the 20th century, and the wine received DOC status in 1968 and DOCG status in 2010. Ripasso first became popular in the 1960s when it was developed and championed by the producer Masi, and the DOC Ripasso della Valpolicella was only created in 2010. To put that into perspective, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc has been around for roughly the same time as Ripasso, and Amarone was first officially recognized only 13 years before Napa Valley became an AVA. The wine styles are, however, rooted in traditional winemaking. Many vineyards are still planted in the historical pergola system, where the grapes grow high above the ground. And the process of drying grapes in order to produce rich and concentrated wines has been around for centuries, and it is essential for the production of 3 out of 4 of the main wine styles. In autumn, the ripe grapes are harvested, but in order to produce an Amarone or Recioto, you cannot just process those grapes, as they would yield a light red wine that doesn't have much to do with either wine style. Instead, those grapes are dried, nowadays usually in plastic baskets, in temperature-controlled and humidity-controlled warehouses that are well ventilated. But let's jump into those wines in order to get a better understanding of the differences and similarities. We bought the 3 main wine styles, Rosso, Ripasso and Amarone, from the same producer in order to be really able to compare and contrast them. And I added a Recioto from a different producer just to pay homage to that historical wine style. Tedeschi means Germans in Italian, and they are located in the Valpolicella region. They are farming 46 hectares of vineyards, and they have been involved in winemaking for 6 generations, but they only really focused on high quality wine at the middle of the 20th century, which is pretty common in the Veneto region, where there weren't too many high-end wineries 100 years ago. So let's start with the 2022 Lucchine Valpolicella Rosso, which is sealed under a screw cap, which doesn't happen that often in traditional Italy. So the vines here are cultivated in the pergola system. Like I already said, the grapes grow fairly high above the ground in the pergola system, which makes it easier to plant other crops below. That's not necessarily a way of producing super high quality grapes, but it's a traditional way of farming vineyards from back in the day. Today, they usually don't farm anything below. They're using the traditional grape varieties. Corvina is considered to be the best grape variety from Valpolicella, but they also have Rondinella, Molinara and Corvignone and some other grape varieties in the mix. So for this wine, the grapes are harvested at the beginning of October, and they are just crushed and fermented in stainless steel, and out comes a fairly light colored red wine. So look at that. That's a pretty typical Valpolicella Rosso kind of color. It's really pale. You can see your fingers through it. It's 12.5% of alcohol, so you're not really reminded of Amarone when you look at this. So the wine smells of ripe cherries, really bright and clear fruit aromas, but there is no spiciness, no oak notes influencing the wine. It's just really fruit driven, really clean and bright. But there's also not too much complexity. I mean, you also have some plum characters there, but it's really just in your face, fresh and fruit driven. But I do like that. So on the palate, it's really fresh, vibrant. The acidity is actually sharp, so there's a real fresh finish there. There aren't too many tannins. It's a light wine. In a blind tasting, you might just think this is a light Pinot Noir, for example. So it's not a rich and concentrated wine. It's really a lively wine representing the north of Italy. So you got to remember that the region is famous for light white wines like Soave, Pinot Grigio and Prosecco. And this wine kind of shows that terroir more than maybe an Amarone does. So it's a light and fresh red. So I'm going to rate this 86 points. I think it's a good wine. Not a super interesting wine. It's not very complex, but it's fresh and lively. And I think with the right meal, this is quite beautiful. But you got to remember that this is made from this. So ripe grapes that are not necessarily the most powerful and concentrated, but grapes that can be turned into a light and fresh wine. But now let's move on to the next. So next up, we have the 2019 San Rocco Valpolicella Ripasso. The vines here are cultivated in a guyot system, so the grapes are not hanging up here. Instead, the vineyard look more similar to what you're probably used to. They are also using Corvina, Corvignone, Rondinella, and a bunch of other autochthonous grape varieties. The grapes for this wine are harvested at the end of September, beginning of October, and they are then processed like just any other red wine. However, from a similar terroir, similar grape varieties, you get a wine that has 14.5% of alcohol. So quite a big difference. And let's see the color. Yeah, as you can see, the color is not super dark, but it's quite a bit darker than the previous wine. So what happened here? The wine was made from fresh berries, but at the beginning of the following year after the harvest, the mar, so the berries from the Amarone production that were previously dried out, are added to the wine, and the wine re-ferments, giving it more power, concentration, color, aroma, all of the good stuff. So this smells more of dark berries like blackberries, blueberries. There's quite a lot of power there, a little bit of spice, a little bit of raisiny character, obviously from the Amarone raisins, and yeah, it's more complex. There's also this lifted character that reminds me a little bit of vinegar, just a touch of it. On the palate, there's much more power, velvety tannins that do have a bit of grip, quite a lot of roundness, richness, and concentration, some chocolate flavor coming through as well. So this is much more complex, much more beefed up, much more concentrated, pretty well made. They also aged this wine in Slovenian oak barrels, so this obviously also changes the texture and the flavor of the wine. But the main difference is that you don't just have berries, just grapes, you also have raisins in here. So let's move on to the 2011 Monte Olmi Amarone Reserva, which is kind of the pinnacle of this lineup. So far, at least. Monte Olmi is the name of the vineyard, and it became one of the first single vineyard Amarones when Lorenzo Tedeschi decided to vinify it separately. So here the vineyard is again cultivated in the traditional pergola system, and they are also planting the same grape varieties as for the other wines, Corvina, Corvignone, Rondinella, and a bunch of other ones. And the grapes were harvested at the end of September, beginning of October, so things are pretty similar to the two previous wines. But what happens next is the most important thing. So the grapes are harvested, and they have to be really careful that they're fully intact, that the skins aren't broken, in order to make sure that they will survive the next few months, because they will be dried for 3 to 4 months in boxes in order to reduce the amount of water in the berries and concentrate everything else. So sugar, polyphenols, and acidity are concentrated in those berries, and the taste and texture of the ingredients also changes. So in order to understand what drying does to those berries, you just need to taste a fresh table grape. It's juicy, watery, there's not too much flavor there, but it tastes okay. And then taste a raisin. Super concentrated, lots of sugar, lots of concentration, way more flavor. So that's kind of what they are doing here. Obviously, those berries don't look like those table grapes, and the raisins will also not look the same. They will be a little bit more juicier, because if you want to make wine out of this, that's going to get really tough. So after a slow fermentation for 30 to 60 days, the wine is aged in barrels for 4 years. Out comes a red wine that has 16% alcohol. 16. So the previous one was 14.5, the first one was 12.5, and this is 16. But what's really important is the taste, so let's give this a whirl. Of course, this is darker in color, but it's also slightly garnet towards the rim, at least, because it's 13 years old. On the nose, it's ripe and rich. There's quite a lot of concentration. It's pretty beautiful. I mean, this is a powerful red wine, but it has quite a lot of elegance and balance. It smells of Amarena cherries. It has this flavor of crème de cassis. There's also a little bit of cinnamon spice flavor going on there in the glass. It's really complex and quite beautiful. On the palate, this is powerful and rich. The tannins are ripe and grippy, but they still kind of dry out my mouth. However, the acidity is also there, as those grapes are not harvested very late in order to get this concentration, but instead are harvested fairly early and then concentrated afterwards. You actually still have quite a lot of acidity in those berries, and as the water evaporates, the acidity is also concentrated. So instead of just having this big, fat, alcoholic wine, you also have like good freshness and liveliness at the end of the palate. This actually doesn't have a lot of residual sugar, in my opinion. It has a really fresh and lively finish. And that at 16% alcohol. The finish is beautiful and long, and this is a wine that I wouldn't want to drink every day because of this power and concentration. But at the right moment, this is just absolutely delicious. And with the right meal, like stews and braised meat, that just goes really well with this. So I'll rate this 94 points. I think it's delicious, beautiful, beautiful wine. And it's not at the end of its cycle. This still feels very young. I think this can age for a couple of decades in order to get a little rounder, a little bit more mellow. But it's also fun to drink now. So the last wine is made in a similar fashion to Amarone. This is the 2018 Giovanni Allegrini Recioto della Valpolicella Classico. And this is also made from raisin grapes, but instead of letting the wine ferment to dryness, it actually still is quite sweet, even though the alcohol is also at an elevated level, 14% in this case. So this style is actually quite historical and has been around for a long time in the region, but it has fallen a bit out of favor, like sweet wines in general, I guess. And it's not made in really large quantities anymore. Amarone is much more popular, and the prices for Amarone can be much higher than for Recioto, while this is actually quite a bit more difficult to make oftentimes. So this is still a baby. I mean, these wines can also age for quite a while. So as you can see, we are back at like a dark ruby color. There's less garnet here than in the Amarone because the Amarone was a little bit older. And looking at it, it just looks like a red wine. You wouldn't expect it to be sweet. This is really interesting. I mean, it doesn't smell like port, for example. You would maybe think a strong, sweet red wine smells a bit porty. This doesn't. It smells quite intense, but not as concentrated as port wine. It has those strawberry characters together with cherry flavors. It doesn't have a lot of spice. It's just really juicy and fresh. It also smells of mocha and a little bit of vinegar again. If you dry grapes, you often get a touch of vinegariness in those berries. This can't be avoided, but the right amount can be actually beneficial. So again, instead of getting the super powerful ripe flavor of very late harvested grapes, you're actually getting quite a lot of fresh fruit flavor of grapes that were harvested fairly early, but then you also get the concentration and richness that you get from drying. On the palate, this is super rich and concentrated. The acidity is definitely there, so it's also quite fresh. It's lively, it's juicy. I mean, I wouldn't want to drink even half a liter of it. Like, this bottle is not a full-size bottle. One glass is just fine. But it's a beautiful wine. So yeah, you can make delicious wines from wrinkled old raisins. And this is a good example of that. I'm going to rate it 91 points. All right, this was a delicious tasting. It kind of highlighted to me that I should taste those wines more often, even though I'm definitely not going to drink them on a very regular basis, but they can be really delicious and they're quite special. They're just different than most other wines in the world. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please like it down here, subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. My question of the day is, what do you think about the wines from Valpolicella? Do you drink them? Do you like them? Haven't you tried them, or have you tried them? Let me know down below in the comments. But whatever you do, stay thirsty.